This week, the world held its breath. A shadow war between Israel and Iran exploded into direct strikes, raising fears of a region-wide conflict. In India, a horrific air crash leaves hundreds dead, shaking the country to its core. Across the United States, protests erupt under the banner "No Kings," challenging presidential power and calling for change. At the same time, world leaders gather for a tense G7 summit in Canada, facing crises they can barely contain. And in Minnesota, an act of political violence raises an even darker question: is democracy under attack from within? This is Nexus Feed Weekly Global News Roundup, your lens into the world as it really is, and where it might be headed. Let's dive straight in. Tensions in the Middle East have turned into open confrontation. For years, Israel and Iran have fought a shadow war: cyber attacks, sabotage, covert operations. But this week, that quiet war became something much louder. Israeli forces launched a series of major strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, military installations, and command centers. The attacks were precise, sustained, and coordinated, involving both air and cyber elements. Iran, unsurprisingly, hit back hard. Dozens of missiles were launched at Israeli territory, targeting military infrastructure and civilian areas alike. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the nation, warning that Iran's ambitions to develop nuclear weapons would not go unanswered. Iranian leaders declared the attacks an act of war and promised what they called a crushing response. In just 48 hours, the conflict evolved from covert operations to a full-blown regional threat. The fear now is escalation. Hezbollah in Lebanon has already begun mobilizing. United States forces in the Gulf have raised alert levels, and oil prices skyrocketing. The United Nations Security Council held an emergency session, but reached no consensus. The United States backed Israel, while China and Russia condemned what they called an unprovoked act of aggression. With diplomacy faltering and military rhetoric rising, the world is staring down the barrel of a new Middle East war. And this time, it might not stay regional. Tragedy struck in India this week when an Air India Boeing 787 Dreamliner crashed just minutes after takeoff from Ahmedabad. The flight was bound for London. It never made it beyond the outskirts of the city. All 241 passengers and crew on board were killed. Several people on the ground also lost their lives as the aircraft slammed into a residential area. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but the destruction was overwhelming. Eyewitnesses described hearing a loud explosion and seeing flames trailing from one of the engines before the plane nosedived. Some reports suggest a catastrophic engine failure, but investigators are urging patience. India's Directorate General of Civil Aviation is leading the investigation, alongside international aviation experts and Boeing officials. The flight's black boxes have been recovered and are being analyzed. Prime Minister Modi expressed deep sorrow and pledged full transparency in the inquiry. He also declared a national day of mourning as families across the country grieve an unimaginable loss. The crash has reignited concerns over aviation safety, particularly with Boeing, whose reputation has taken several hits over the past few years. While it's too early to draw conclusions, the scale of this tragedy will likely trigger renewed scrutiny of aircraft design, maintenance, and regulation. For now, India mourns, and the world watches closely. In the United States, tens of thousands took to the streets this week in what protesters called the No Kings movement. The message? Democracy is not a monarchy. The protests erupted in response to a military parade in Washington, D.C., organized by the Trump administration and seen by many as a symbol of authoritarian overreach. But this wasn't just about the parade. Protesters marched in over a dozen cities, including New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Seattle. Their demands included protecting voting rights, stopping the deportation of undocumented immigrants, and pushing back against what they call Trump's expanding executive power. The atmosphere was tense but largely peaceful. In Portland and Chicago, however, clashes broke out between demonstrators and police. Dozens were arrested. In some cities, curfews were briefly enforced. President Trump dismissed the protests as, quote, a coordinated attack on American values, while doubling down on his administration's authority. His opponents say the protests are a wake-up call, that democratic norms are eroding, and the American people are paying attention. Whether these demonstrations will evolve into something larger remains to be seen. But one thing is clear, the political divide in the United States isn't just growing, it's erupting onto the streets. While the streets of America were filled with protesters, the halls of diplomacy opened in Canada. The leaders of the G7, Canada, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, met to discuss a world in turmoil. The Israel-Iran conflict dominated private meetings, but so did economic instability, especially with the global ripple effects of rising oil prices and renewed trade wars. President Trump arrived at the summit facing criticism not just abroad but from fellow G7 leaders. His use of tariffs, especially against European steel and Chinese tech, has sparked inflation and supply chain disruption worldwide. European leaders pressed for an end to the tariffs and a return to coordinated trade policy. Climate change was another flashpoint. The United States remains opposed to binding emissions targets, while Europe and Japan push for urgent action. The divide is growing, and with each summit, questions about the G7's relevance grow louder. Still, the leaders did manage to issue a joint statement urging restraint in the Middle East. But behind closed doors, sources say the divisions were deeper than ever. The world's most powerful democracies are struggling, not just to lead but to agree on what leadership even looks like. Finally, a disturbing story from the American heartland. In Minnesota, a state lawmaker was shot and killed in what authorities believe was a politically motivated attack. Another lawmaker, also targeted, remains in critical condition. The suspect, a former campaign volunteer with a history of online extremism, was apprehended after a tense standoff with police. Investigators say the shooter left behind a manifesto railing against what he called government betrayal. The incident has sent shockwaves through the country. It's being treated as an act of domestic terrorism. President Trump condemned the attack, calling it a tragedy for all Americans. But critics say the increasingly hostile political climate, fueled by rhetoric from the highest levels, has made violence feel inevitable. In recent years, threats against elected officials have skyrocketed. Capitol Police report that over 10,000 threats were investigated last year alone. This week's attack isn't just a tragedy, it's a warning. The polarization in the United States isn't just political anymore. It's becoming deadly. So, here we are, on a planet that feels like it's spinning faster and in the wrong direction. Missiles fly in the Middle East. Planes fall from the sky. Protesters march for democracy while politicians fall to bullets. And the world's leaders gather looking for answers but offering few. What connects these stories is more than just time. It's a sense that something deeper is breaking, that institutions once thought stable are now struggling under the weight of war, disaster, and division. But in crisis, there is also clarity. The protests show people still care. The summits, flawed as they are, show the world is still trying. And even amid tragedy, we are reminded that the fight for truth, for justice, and for peace is far from over. This has been your Nexus Feed Roundup of the top 5 global news items of the week. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and join us next week for another roundup of stories shaping our shared future. And until then, stay informed, stay compassionate, and most of all, stay hopeful.